We are honored to have with us Professor Martha Chen as the session chair. Professor Martha Chen is lecturer in public policy, Harvard University, and the chair UNU Wider Advisory Board. May I kindly invite Professor Chen to take the chair and guide the proceedings. Please join us on the stage.
Good evening, everyone. Namaste. It's such a pleasure to be in Delhi. And it's my pleasure to welcome you now to this keynote session. We've had an inaugural lecture, now we have a keynote lecture of the 2026 Wider Development Conference. As all of us know far too well, the topic of this conference has unfortunately become even more timely than we could have anticipated. It is taking place at a moment when development debates are being reshaped not only by fragmentation in the global economy, rising uncertainty in trade and finance, and the growing urgency of climate and industrial transformation, but also by the renewed intensified conflict in the Middle East and its wider repercussions. That conflict is a stark reminder that a fractured world is not, as Kunal said, an abstract concept. It has immediate consequences for people's lives, stability, mobility, markets, jobs, energy, and the prospects for international cooperation. Across these pressures runs a central question: how can countries in the global south build productive capacity, upgrade industries, and generate inclusive growth under today's constraints? And that makes the evening's lecture especially timely. So it's my pleasure to say that our keynote speaker is Professor Erik Verhoeven of Columbia University, Professor of Economics and International and Public Affairs, and co-director of the Center for Development Economics and Policy. Professor Verhoeven is widely recognized for his research on firms, trade, technology adoption, quality upgrading, and industrial development in low and middle income countries. This evening, he speaks on a question at the core of the conference agenda: the barriers to industrial upgrading. We are also fortunate to be joined by two distinguished discussants. Mr. Ajay Shankar is Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the ISID and formerly Industry Secretary to the Government of India. He brings deep experience at the intersection of industrial policy, government, and structural transformation. And Dr. Zainab Usman is a Senior Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs and Managing Director for International Programs at the Energy Opportunity Lab. Her work brings together insights on energy development, trade, and the policy challenges facing emerging markets. The format this evening is straightforward. Professor Verhoeven will deliver his keynote, after which our discussants will offer reflections, and then we can then open the conversation to the audience. So please welcome Professor Verhoeven. Yes? No damage done, I don't think, please.
great pleasure to be here. I'm honored to be speaking in this venue, somewhat daunted, as Suman Berry was also saying, to be following this distinguished group. My topic, as Marty said, is upgrading. Upgrading by firms in developing countries and the factors that shape it. What do I mean by upgrading? I mean innovative behavior by firms, but I mean that in a broader sense than the word innovation is usually used in. So innovation is often understood to mean things that are new to the world. And in fact, the whole field of innovation economics is essentially about, it's essentially about firms moving the world frontier forward. It's relying heavily on R&D and patents as empirical measures. For developing country firms, typically, although there are some exceptions, but typically the goal is to catch up to the world frontier, not to move the world frontier forward. Measures of patents and R&D are less meaningful, less informative in such contexts. And so I think we need to broaden the notion and think about catch-up, think about upgrading. I like the word upgrading very much because it incorporates this form of catching up, which typically would not be found in the patents and R&D measures and other measures of innovation that are typically used. Now, upgrading, in the way I've defined it, you would think, in terms of catching up, should be easier, or adopting an existing technology should be easier than inventing a new one. In a not very politically correct, or now not very politically correct turn of phrase, Alexander Gerschenkron, a famous historian, refers to this as an advantage of backwardness. It's an advantage of being a late developer, is that there are a lot of technologies and products that are out there on the shelf, as Suman Berry was mentioning, that it should be possible to absorb. But for many developing country firms, these advantages have remained elusive. I think it's not controversial to say that. I describe that as evident. And so my motivating question, or guiding question for this talk is, what's getting in the way? What are the barriers? Anytime you identify a barrier, you're implicitly identifying a causal factor that could be considered a driver as well. Just if nothing else, than by removing the barrier. So I'm going to use barriers and drivers as in alternative senses, two sides of the same coin. Now, early development economists, these questions of industrial development and I would say upgrading were central to the development of the field. When Gunnar Myrdal was cited earlier, when you go back to the early development economists, this is certainly something you were thinking about front of mind. But I think for many years, at least in my sort of research career, say the last 20, 30 years, with the rise of empirical development economics, these issues have been a little bit on the periphery. Interesting question about why that was, but there hasn't been so much focus, or there hadn't been so much focus until quite recently on firms. Partly that's because data on firms is hard to access. The experimental revolution, for which, or randomista would be the turn of phrase that's sort of used internally, for which Banerjee and Duflo and Kramer won the Nobel Prize, mainly focused not on firms, but on individuals, in part because it was hard to run experiments. It continues to be hard to run experiments on firms. And so as people explored this new methodology of randomized control trials and RCTs, these questions of industrial development got pushed a bit to the side. So happily, I'd say the situation's been changing. There's more and more research on firms, and I would call, well identified in an econometric sense. So worrying about causality and trying to carefully measure, progress towards upgrading. That's been an emerging area. I now think it's a recognized subfield within development, what I sometimes called firms in development, or I like the phrase industrial development. So I'm very excited that ISID has that in his name and is the host. But in either case, so what I'm going to be doing, part here is giving you a bit of a progress report on this field, on micro-empirical research on how firms actually behave, typically with some attention to causality, with not necessarily only experiments, but with some experiments. Okay. So I discussed there are lots of important methodological issues about conceptually how do we think of upgrading, also how do we measure progress in upgrading. I think there are important issues. They're not very accessible to a general audience. And so what I'm going to do instead of that, I'm going to focus on what I consider some concrete substantive insights that are emerging from this literature in 4 areas: in organizations, around customers, and I'll become clear what I mean by that, social learning, and competition. You can follow the bubbles along the top as we go. Okay. One insight that I think has emerged from this literature is that management practices are very important. This has been a very, very influential, highly cited literature. Probably the leading paper in this literature is this paper by Bloom, Eifert, Mahajan, McKenzie, and Roberts, an experiment on consulting and management practices among 17 Mumbai area textile firms, where they randomly allocated consulting from an internationally known consultancy. I won't say the name, but it is one that you would all recognize, where they did for all firms. So 17 is not a large number. There were 11 treated, six non-treated. We can discuss that in the question and answer if you like about how they deal with the small numbers. But what they did is for 17 firms got 1 month of a diagnostic phase of consultancy, and then the treated firms got 4 months of intensive consulting. The market value of which was around $250,000. That's not what the researchers paid, but what the firms would have paid. And they tracked a long list of management practices, which they often refer to as modern management practices, or management practices that this consultancy often recommends to firms, including regular maintenance of machinery, tracking of inventory, daily displays of the productivity of weavers and of each individual loom, and then another practice that's tracked is whether they have performance-based pay systems. The paper in part became famous for photos that appear in the paper about. There are some firms that appear not to have adopted fairly basic, management practice. So this is a picture of the inventory warehouse, sort of holding thread and yarn that in principle should be used for textiles, but it was clearly a mess. So that's. It seems like they had not optimized their inventory management system in this firm. What they found is that the consulting had positive effects when they track. I don't know if I have a. No, it's not going to. I don't have a pointer. Okay, but here on the y-axis is the share of these 38 management practices that the firms had adopted, and then just time, months after the diagnostic phase, so that you could see the first 4 months are where the consultants are are there in the factories, the treatment plants and the control plants, and then they also have the tracked adoption in plants that were in the treated firms, but not the treated plants, right? We're not where the consultants actually were, but we're in other plants within the same firm. And you can see that, indeed, the share of these modern management practices went up, including for the control plants especially. They adopted some after this diagnostic phase. They also had consulting for a month. But the treatment, there was a clear separation, and those treatment plants that got the 4 months of intensive consulting adopted more of these practices. They track a number of different outcomes. One key one is quality defects, and so you can see there that the quality defects index declined, which is a good thing for the treatment plants relative to the control plants. And so part of what the consultants were explaining was that rather than just trying to produce as much cloth as possible and then going back and reworking the quality defects had to be identified early on and corrected. And so in the end, that ends up saving a lot of time because the quality control is integrated throughout the manufacturing process. Okay, so I think this has been a rightfully influential study showing that consulting can be helpful and also that management practices are important. I do want to share a couple of quick words of caution. It's been interpreted as identifying that showing both that these management practices are a good thing and that firms are making mistakes by not adopting them. And those two conclusions, I think, are a little bit need some qualification. So one is that the best practices may depend on the setting. So some of these practices that they identify, like labeling inventory, do seem like what I would call a no-brainer. It do seem like clearly everyone should be doing inventory better than that factory we saw the photo of. On the other hand, performance pay, for instance, it's less clear that in every setting that a performance pay is a good thing. And I'm going to give you an example coming next of a setting where performance pay has an ambiguous, or it's not clear whether it's a good thing or not. A second word of caution is that the consulting may have had an effect on outcomes not through the adoption of the 38 practices, but a direct effect. So having those consultants in the factory for 4 months had a direct effect on productivity or on quality. That may not, this is, I guess, an econometric point, that we shouldn't necessarily identify that effect with the practices themselves. And so we need, it's a word of caution there. And then also, just that learning how to adopt new practices can be costly in itself if firms lack that know-how. And so they're not necessarily making mistakes by not adopting them. If they, for a firm to spend $250,000 in order to get the calculation in the paper was profits of $300,000 per year, noisily measured, it's not clear that they're making a mistake by not making that investment early on. Okay, so anyway, but one thing, like, key point here is just that management practice seem to matter, and that consulting or intensive information sharing with firms can be helpful. I would, more broadly, I would think of management practices also as a technology choice, or the choice of management practice as a technology choice. I'm going to talk now about a separate experiment, which was one of my own, with co-authors, also thinking about a technology, where here it's actual physical technology, which I'll show you about. It's about for cutting of artificial leather for soccer balls, or I guess I should say footballs, depending on the audience, trying to be more international here, in Sialkot, Pakistan, with a surprising result. So let me tell you a little bit about this. The key input into soccer balls is Rexin, this artificial leather. It's about half of the cost, is this which is forms the exterior of the ball. The standard design, I'm going to show it here, has hexagons and pentagons. So this guy, and if we can, let's see, we're going to test the IT capability here. We're going to show, yes, thank you. That was very seamless, so congratulations to the IT team. You can see they're going quite quickly. And these guys are the most experienced workers in the factory, often had been there for 15 or 20 years. Let's show this one more time, the video, so they can see that process. Okay, back to the slides. Yeah, so that's the key step. Now, he was cutting hexagons there. You can see the hexagon die. And then the ball, the standard design of the ball also has pentagons. And you can see that the pentagon die there is, they imitate the hexagon die in the sense that the sides are flush. There's a full flush side. And here's, I'm going to show you now a picture of that's a sheet of Rexin after hexagons have been cut out of it. Hexagons tessellate. You can tile the floor with hexagons, and those cutters are pretty good at minimizing the waste, which is the most expensive, by far the most expensive input. Pentagons, it's a harder problem. You can't tile a floor with pentagons, or not regular pentagons. And you can see that there were not only the die was imitating the hexagon die, but the cutting pattern was imitating the hexagon cutting pattern. And about 20 or 24% of the Rexin was being wasted, right, as opposed to just 8% of the hexagons. Okay, so it turns out that cutting pattern is not the optimal cutting pattern. There's a longer story, but basically I was watching a video of a Chinese factory that was producing the 2010 World Cup ball, the Jabulani ball, and I noticed that pentagons were being cut in a different pattern than the pattern that was being used in Sialkot. Turns out mathematicians were aware of this. There's a whole branch of mathematics of which I was ignorant on packing problems. So they were aware of a superior packing, which you can see, and also Wikipedia. I could have Googled just Wikipedia at the time. Pentagon, it's still there, I believe, this design. You can see that the vertex to the midpoint of the base, vertex to the midpoint of the base, and then flip it around 180 degrees, and so you can get more pentagons per sheet. Many years ago, I had the foresight to marry an architect. So my wife and I sat down after having seen this video, and we knew the size of the pentagons, we knew the size of the sheets of Rexin. We figured out that essentially using that optimal design of pentagons, you can get about 8% more pentagons per sheet, and that became the basis for the new technologies. There's a picture there of a pentagon die. You can see it's offset. It's not sharing a full side. It's sharing just half of a side. And with that die, you can get 8% more pentagons per sheet, which works out to be, if you can see it there, I know Marty in the corner, it's about 1% reduction in costs. That's not an enormous reduction in cost. On the other hand, margins are very tight in this industry. Profit margins are about 8%, so you would have expected them to pay attention to a 1% reduction in cost. And in fact, we thought, when we were getting ready to do the experiment, we were being very secretive about our pentagon technology, and we thought, okay, it's going to spread so fast, we don't want anybody to know. And okay, so we gave it out. I'm going to a short, quick summary. Gave it out, almost nobody adopted. We gave it out to, of the 135 firms in town that we found, we gave it out to 35. 15 months later, a grand total of 6 had adopted this technology, there's a theorem right? Saying that you can get more pentagons per sheet, and actually you don't have to change anything else about the production, or almost nothing else about the production process in order to use this technology. So that was quite surprising. There was one big firm, again, this is for Q&A, we can talk more, one big firm with 2,000 or more employees who had adopted fully this technology. And so we were quite confident that the technology was actually working, but we were puzzled about why it hadn't spread. We asked owners why not, and what they told us was employee resistance. Their workers don't like it. Okay? And in retrospect, it turned out it was clear because those guys who've been doing this job for 20 years are paid piece rates, and they just want to go quickly. They had no incentive to reduce waste. They had no incentive to be green. And they said this is a green technology reducing waste, but they had no incentive to reduce waste. And so if they were to adopt, this would slow them down. Right? We acknowledge that it would slow them down at least, what can I say? They were worried they'd be slowed down forever. It turns out that they got up to speed in about a month, but they didn't know that, so they were worried their incomes, if there were no other change, would be permanently lower. And so quite reasonably and rationally, they told the owners it was a terrible technology and that they shouldn't adopt it. And so then we ran a second experiment where we gave a bonus of 1 month's salary. It's not very much, $150 for most of these cutters, which is sort of the elite of the soccer ball workers, but it's still not very much money. And if they passed the test in the presence of the owner to show that the cutting technology worked and could be done reasonably, the workers were quite excited by that experiment, and they passed the test, and we found a statistically significant share of firms adopted the technology as a result of running this experiment. Okay. So what are some of the takeaways? One, the way we say it is the misalignment of incentives within firms can impede information flows. So organizational frictions, organizational conflict can get in the way. That's a barrier, get in the way of technology adoption. Another one is that inertia in labor contracts may hinder technological change. So in a technologically stable environment, which this was in Sealcoat for 20 years, maybe piece rates were the optimal thing, but then once there's a new idea in town, it's hard to change away from the contracts that you had, hard to change away from piece rates. So there's inertia in that way. I think an important point, back to the observation that sometimes it's coming out of the management literature, people are just making mistakes, or the firms are just making mistakes, is that we have a story about a firm failing to adopt a surplus enhancing technology, even if all individuals are optimizing. Right? So there's no individual in this firm that's making a mistake. It's just that there's a contractual friction that's hard for them to resolve. We can talk more about that, but that's the basic intuition. And then I think the op-ed version, but which I believe, is that workers need to expect to share in the gains to adoption for adoption to be successful. You need buy-in at all levels of an organization. Okay, so that's the takeaways from the Pentagon series. That's about what I was going to say about organizations. Okay, so that's one sort of category of barriers or drivers of upgrading. So now let me talk about some factors that are external to firms. So far I've been talking about things that are internal to firms. External factors also matter, and in particular what I want to emphasize is that richer consumers are very demanding and tend to demand higher quality, and that can have salutary effects on firms. Okay, so that when you increase sales to richer consumers, you essentially have to improve quality in many sectors, and then there's increasing evidence also that in itself can stimulate learning. So it's not just I'm producing products that I knew how to produce already that happen to be higher quality, but I learned something in the process. So let me tell you about another experiment, which I think is the best. It's not the only work on this, but it's sort of the cleanest evidence on this, is David Atkin, Amit Khandawal, and Adam Osman ran an experiment among Egyptian rug producers where they randomly allocated initial export contracts. Okay, so they worked with a buyer of rugs, big international buyer, to randomly allocate just the first contract. It wasn't not persistent, but just a first contract. They were willing to randomly allocate among a set of Egyptian rug producers. They tracked quality indicators. They kept track of conversations between the buyer and the producers. And then they actually had a laboratory where they asked producers to weave identical rugs under laboratory conditions there in the lab. I have a table of results here that I don't expect you to follow all the numbers in the table, but this is just to say they tracked all these are different dimensions of quality of rugs, how the corners are done, the waviness, the weight, the touch, the packiness, et cetera, and those things are responding positively to this experimental intervention. So when firms were asked to start exporting, they started producing rugs that had these greater quality, that higher values of these characteristics. There's a technical point, which is they also started taking longer to weave the rugs. So if you were just measuring, productivity by output, then that would be misleading because they're producing less square meters of rug per hour. Anyway, just to say we have to be careful about how we're measuring productivity. Okay, the quality went up, and it went up even for these identical specification rugs. So when they said, this is the kind of rug I want, these are the specifications, those producers who had received the export contracts produced, had higher values of these quality characteristics at no more time. I'm just quickly, I'm conscious of time, so I'm just quickly summarizing what's there in the table. But essentially, without more time, they produced higher quality rugs, which looks a lot like they learned something in the process of producing higher quality. Okay, so this selling to richer consumers seems to induce firms to try to produce a different set of products, higher quality set of products, and learn something in the process. That same idea has been found by another paper. This is by, I don't know, Alfonso, I think, Alfaro Ureña, Isabel Manalici, and Jose Vasquez. This is a picture who are studying the effect of selling to a multinational corporation. Okay, so this is the picture of the Intel campus in Costa Rica, where they're doing work. They're using VAT data, which is a very exciting new data source, which India also has through the GST system, where you can see firm-to-firm sales. Okay, so I think that's an important, on research terms, that's an important new dimension. And so they compare the outcomes of firms that start supplying to multinational corporations versus suppliers to other types of firms. In particular, my favorite comparison is this. They have many comparisons in the paper, but my favorite one is this one, where they're comparing firms that start supplying to multinational corporations to firms that start supplying to domestic exporting firms, which in other ways are similar but are not owned by multinationals. And this is just sales to others, sales to firms besides the one multinational or the one domestic exporter that they're tracking. Okay, and so what you can see is that in year zero, when they start selling to the multinational, they start selling to the domestic exporter, their sales to other firms goes down. There's a capacity constraint, so that's natural. Some of those, they're not selling as much to those other firms. But then over time, it quickly recovers. And in fact, for the ones that are selling to multinationals, those are the green circles, they expand sales to others. Okay, even relative to the firms that are selling to domestic exporters. They also look at here, you can see their measured productivity goes up. Those other buyers of the multinational corporations, of the suppliers to multinationals, the other buyers tend to be larger, have higher export and import shares, and have longer relationship with suppliers. So it looks like they're able to sell to a more attractive set of firms. And so the interpretation of the paper, which I think is right, is that selling to multinationals, that firms are learning something by selling to multinationals, right? Not they're gaining reputation. It's part of a branding thing. They can say, now I sell to Intel, and so therefore others should buy from me. But also there's lots of detail in the paper about how the demanding specifications of Intel or other multinationals, how meeting those helps them to sell to others. Okay, so what's the takeaway here so far is that being able to satisfy demanding customers requires learning and then has positive effects subsequently. All right, so this external orientation is quite important. And I think it's relevant also in the Indian setting. When I think about the production-linked incentives programs, often seem to be quite domestic-oriented, sort of my reading, that they're interested in increasing domestic output, not necessarily, exports are mentioned, but are not necessarily incentivized, and so that I think is relevant, right? So that I think one message we're coming from this is that those external customers are helpful, have these salutary effects on firms. Okay, someone's going to have, Marty, you're going to have to help me with time. I'm not sure how.
It's getting to be about
5 more minutes. I see. Okay, all right. So let me. Well, I'll talk faster. Maybe okay. I'll squeeze it a bit. Okay. Also on the, I think a very interesting, sort of paper results in this spirit of how selling to having to produce higher quality in order to satisfy international buyers can have positive effects. There's a paper by Chris Hansman, Jonas Hjort, Gianmarco Leone Ciliota, and Matteo Teixu on Peruvian fish meal firms, What's very interesting about fish meal is that the output quality is actually observable. It's essentially the protein content of the fish meal, and so that they can see. But also at the same time, the input quality, which is the freshness of the fish that are used in order to produce fish meal, is not observable. Even on the dock, you can't really tell how fresh those fish are. And so what happened, what they use, they use quotas. So the main competitors of producing high quality fish meal are Denmark, Iceland, and Chile. So when those places hit their quotas, that increases the demand for Peruvian high quality fish meal. Okay? So in those cases, they sort of have a that's a source of exogenous variation, we would say, which is trying to identify the causal effect of increased demand for quality. When there's increased demand for quality, these Peruvian fish meal factories go out and buy boats. They integrate vertically, right? Why do they do that? In order to ensure that the fish is fresh when it arrives at the dock. Okay, so that's, I think, a strong signal that input quality matters for output quality. The other work has shown that as well, and that organizational forms can respond to these demands for quality. Okay, is that, I don't know if that's clear, right? And then they also show, interestingly, that the Peruvian government tracks where the boats are. There's GPS trackers on all these boats. And so those boats that are owned by the fish meal plants go out further. They don't go out as far, and they return more quickly to the port. Okay. Firms learning from other firms. I'm again conscious of time. Let me just say, I'll say very quickly, there's a, how do firms learn? One way that firms learn is from other firms in their own sectors. Okay, how do I know that? There are a couple, I think. Well, this is probably the leading paper, is by Tsai and Seidel, if I pronounced the Chinese right, where they randomly put firms together in meeting groups, or the treatment group were put in meeting groups, and then they followed the control firms as well, that met monthly for a year, and they found large effects on profits and on management practices of those firms just from being put together in meeting groups with other entrepreneurs. And then one piece of evidence that they showed is that they also injected information into some groups, either about a government grant or about a savings opportunity. The government grant was more rival in the sense there was more competition among firms. In the savings opportunity, it didn't matter how many other firms had that information. And they found that the information spread more if it was non-rival. So that the savings opportunity information spread, the grant spread less. Okay, so that's also interesting, I think consistent with their basic story, that there is information flowing and that how much competition there is among firms matters. Okay, I wanted to tell you also now about a brand new paper. This is in Dhaka, Bangladesh, also of mine with co-authors, about the social learning effects. It's relevant also for in the case what I've been doing here, besides being hosted generously here for this talk, is I've been doing field work in Indian clusters where I think this technology might actually be useful as well. But it's a servo motor, which is an energy efficient motor. I'm going to show you a picture here. So this is for stitching machines for leather goods in our case, although similar technology is applicable also in garment firms. So the servo motor, the short version is it doesn't have it uses about 70 or 75% less electricity. The clutch motor, traditional motor, has a warm-up period. You have to turn it on for a couple of seconds, and so people tend to leave it on even when the needle's not moving. The servo motor doesn't require a warm-up period. You only uses energy when the needle moves, and so ended up using a lot less energy. We randomly gave out some servo motors in this cluster in Dhaka. And to some firms we just gave information, and some firms we did nothing. I have a couple of tables here, which I'm just going to summarize very briefly to say, Dhaka, the firms are very clustered. This is a map of essentially central Dhaka. Each black dot is a firm. You can see they're very, very clustered. And these firms are extremely close together. So this is the bottom right there. That's Old Dhaka or Bangsha. This is a picture in the bottom left. Is a picture of that's one street, right, in Bangsha, for which we have a picture. That's that street, and you can see there are probably 150 along the couple of blocks, 150 firms, a couple of block radius there, and so they're extremely clustered. Essentially, the basic finding is that having a neighbor who receives the motor has a significant positive effect on whether a firm adopts the motor itself. Okay, so. That essentially being exposed to a firm that was in our T2 group if you're in, let me go back to my, sorry, I'm gonna, here. If you're in T2 group, which you got the motor yourself, but sorry, if you're in T1 group, you just got a video or control. If you're in T1 or control and you have a neighbor who got T2, who got you're much more likely to adopt, you're 19% more likely to adopt the motor than if you didn't have such a neighbor. Okay, and that effect is actually larger than being shown a video of that neighbor. Okay, I can talk more in details about how we control for the fact that some firms are centrally located, and that's maybe not random who's centrally located. We have ways of controlling for that fact. Okay, so I think it's pretty strong evidence that distance that there are spillovers. Okay, and we also find that distance matters. So this is the coefficient. If you ran it with a regression on the number of neighbors that are treated, and then you look by distance, you can see that within 250 meters or 500 meters walking distance, that matters a lot, and then it dies out. Okay, and then actually, so that effect we find is much stronger. We also looked at the effect of having someone in your communication network, the set of people that you say you talk to on the phone or in person about technology, or having shared suppliers or shared repair technicians. That would be another form of network link, or having other sorts of shared links. We ask people where they go to pray. All those things. We didn't find much of an evidence of adoption of spillovers there. We did find evidence of spillovers on a very narrow geographic scale. Okay. Just to say, if anyone's interested in this project, we've been in clusters in Agra and Mathura and Delhi in the last 3 days, and this technology is ripe for diffusion, and so it's something that maybe could be explored in India as well. Okay, I'm gonna skip because conscious of time. I was going to say something about the effects of competition on upgrading. I think there's some effect, but the effects are somewhat unclear. It's sort of hard to interpret the effects of competition. So I think we shouldn't just say, I'll say about that is just the increase in competition is not a panacea, right? Upgrading is not necessarily going to follow from greater competition. Okay, let me try and sum up, and then we can get to the discussion comments. Some drivers that seem to be important. So practices that encourage information sharing within firms seem to be important for upgrading. Pressure from demanding customers is important. Learning spillovers from nearby firms. All those things seem to be important drivers of the upgrading process. Some other topics that I haven't had a chance to talk very much about, but are in this review paper that I mentioned. The role of family ownership and control, and the role of input quality availability. Maybe we can, if people want to talk about that, we can do it in the Q&A. Let me just say about input quality. Often imported inputs tend to be, on average, higher quality often than domestic inputs. And so having access to those high quality imported inputs can be important for the upgrading process. So another way that sort of international engagement may be important for upgrading. And the big challenge, I think, is how to promote learning in firms. So what are the 3 takeaways, I think? Now, trying to step back from this big literature this emerging literature on firms in development. One is that I think there's increasing evidence that spillovers are important. That provides a natural rationale for policy interventions to speed upgrading. Often firms won't fully internalize, the positive effects that they're having on other firms by upgrading. And so I think, maybe this is a friendly audience for this idea that there's a rationale for industrial policy interventions. But I do think, as I was saying before, international engagement is also quite important, right? So the selling to demanding consumers is quite important, and access to high quality inputs is important. And then also I would say, back to the organizations part of the lecture, learning is not automatic. Just having a sector, just subsidizing a sector so the sector exists, you're not necessarily going to have learning, right? You have to be aware, be attuned to the organizational barriers that might get in the way as well. I have not said much about specific policy interventions. In part, I think that's because the literature, the sort of careful empirical micro-literature evaluating industrial policy intervention is still pretty thin, partly for the reasons that I discussed before, that it's, for many years there wasn't much, there wasn't much literature on these, this wave of micro-empirical literature when it started out was not mainly focused on firms. And so we don't have, I think we need a whole, generations of researchers to go out and evaluate industrial policy interventions and give us the results. That's going to take time, obviously, and some policy doesn't have to be taken before that happens. But I do think that in parallel, that would be a good thing to happen. And let me just say, if I had to identify one sort of policy direction to explore and talk about, it would be export promotion. And I haven't said very much, and again, maybe we can talk in the Q&A. I've recently done an experiment in Tunisia on export promotion where the Tunisian government randomly allocated matching grants for exports, where the government would basically provide a 50% subsidy for fixed costs for exporting. That had big effects on exporting. They found large effects. I think exporting has all these salutary effects, in part because consumers tend to be richer, it tends to induce quality upgrading, that also tends to induce learning. And so I think if I had to put my finger on one area where promising on policy terms, it would be policy upgrading. Okay, the non-experimental evidence is somewhat mixed, but we have this RCT that had positive effects. Let me stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. It's my first exposure to this new wave of literature, so thank you for that. And I'll turn now to the two discussants, and maybe we'll start with Ajay Sharma. And I'm told we should not turn the mics on or off. They're all set to go. So they each have 10 minutes. Yeah? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Let me first of all begin by expressing admiration for whatever I've heard. And at this age, one doesn't hear a lecture and feel that one has learnt a lot. So I can add that. And I must compliment you for choosing this topic. Because I think firms don't get the attention in policy analysis and economic literature as they do. So they're all about macroeconomic issues or other issues, but firms are the real players in the market. The economies are basically populated by firms, and firm behavior is what is very critical. And I'm so glad that you have brought it center stage, and it's the inaugural keynote address. A few observations based on my experience of India. So the first point you made, I think, is terribly important for developing countries, is that at some stage of development, you don't need R&D and patents. You need just to catch up with what is there in the world. So in India, we mourn that we are not spending enough on R&D and we are not getting enough patents. Well, all the things you've talked about are low-hanging fruits. The second observation, which is India-centric, but I think it's worth making, that till we opened up our economy to the rest of the world, we had a closed economy. And within that closed economy, for historical reasons, we had family-owned enterprises. And family-owned enterprises were really people who understood money rather than the production process. So as long as they could make money through what you'd call rent-seeking, they didn't pay much attention to the production process. And your photographs were very revealing, because I've seen many such factories in the course of my career. And a management which is completely indifferent. We have had an added problem in India in terms of our social hierarchies. So that again is a great barrier to any attempt at increasing productivity or understanding how productivity can increase. But in the Indian context, we have now today huge contrasts, and the contrasts are worth, I think, exploring in greater detail. So our first real success stories came from the point you made about the consumer. So the first real success came when we got the Japanese to help us set up our car industry and the auto component industry. So these were not traditional entrepreneurs. Many of them were just, selected on a, what you'd call a beauty parade kind of thing. I like you, somebody sent you. You'll set up the factory, you'll produce. But because they've started from scratch and didn't inherit a culture, which you demonstrate in the photographs, so they became extraordinarily good. And so many of them won quality prizes of the Deming Awards. Then I saw a similar transformation in another sector when some Indian garment producers started exporting garments. So the moment they were to sell for an exporter, then they knew that whatever they were doing till then wouldn't work. So they modernized, and modernized very well. And now I'm seeing that amazing transformation with what Apple has brought about in India. So they've grown at a phenomenal pace. and they have for once and all decisively shattered the myth that Indians cannot manufacture well. And that large-scale manufacturing is not possible, or managing a large workforce is not possible. So employing about 130,000 people by now, I think their total volume production is about 20%, and with whatever government incentives are there to make good the cost disadvantage, in their international system, they're as good as production in China. So this issue of the consumer or being the MNC is quite important, and I think India has benefited enormously by opening up its economy. But where we still have a problem, and that's the thing you highlighted, is that the bulk of our firms are still not experiencing the transition at the pace they should. And I liked your last point, that that's the space for government policy. But government policy thinking is all about some subsidies, interest subsidy, capital grant, or some quota, or even the PLI is a heavy-handed instrument. So the subtle, tailor-made policy interventions is an area which is weak for all countries and certainly weak in our country. But I think your work certainly drives home the point that that's a low-hanging fruit with very little cost. You can get very big results. And India, it's also a crisis because a lot of these old enterprises are actually being marginalized or driven to decline or disappearance. So I think this is a very important area for sector-specific, cluster-specific studies. And government money spent there in whatever the consultant did in some firm, it's very little money and the results would be enormous. There is one other positive factor that I think gives me great hope in the future, is that the family-owned enterprises, which understood money, now have a second generation which is better educated, understands engineering and technology. And what they're doing is amazing. And that is yet to be seen in terms of its effect. It'll take a few more years, but I'll just narrate two unusual success stories of Indian industrialization. For reasons of political correctness, they are not celebrated. But these are technology-driven. So one is Sula, the wine industry. Born out of nothing. When I was young, we didn't know how to drink wine. We couldn't distinguish between good wine and bad wine. When I was secretary industry, I went to Nasik and I was being offered a wine tasting tour. And Financial Times had a front page story on Sula. And the other success story is more recent. Young Indian entrepreneurs have created a factory where they make single malt whiskies and they claim they win global prizes and they price themselves sky high. So with those comments, I would end. But I would again say that this is very, very useful because industrial policy has to have a granular understanding of the grassroots reality and then prescriptions. Because macro level prescriptions, we've done a lot in India. We've spent fortunes over the decades. And outcomes are, I think, quite modest when you look at the amount of money we've spent. Thank you.
Thank you for your very grounded, informed insights. That was very helpful. So over to Zainab.
Thank you very much. That was a very informative presentation. I also read the paper and a couple of publications of yours on that front. Definitely very refreshing to see empirical work on this front, particularly around, as you mentioned, firms, but also firms that export. What I'm going to do is, I guess I would like to pose 3 key questions around the feasibility and the viability of the pursuit of policy. So basically, picking up where you left off on the policy discussion. So the feasibility and the viability of industrial policies, basically, to promote industrial upgrading or to facilitate industrial upgrading at this particular moment in time. And I'm hoping that those questions are going to touch on maybe 2 elements of your presentation on rich customers and on social learning. So the questions are on policy autonomy, export market access, and coordination. I suppose the first question is whether low and middle income countries can seize this particular moment to pursue effective policies that facilitate and promote industrial upgrading. And the reason for posing this question is, obviously we've discussed the fracturing of the global economic order and its various drivers, and we know a lot of those drivers, but there's one in particular that I'd like to pick up on, and this is the debate that has been happening for a couple of years, maybe since the 2010s, and maybe accelerated by the COVID pandemic, and perhaps that is still happening right now in many countries, but particularly in high-income countries, around the relationship between the state and the market, right? Which is why we're seeing the prioritization of national security in economic policy, the privileging of national security also in foreign policy. But as part of this debate is, and in a sense, it's almost as if that debate has almost been settled, but it's really overturning an orthodoxy that existed for decades that the role of economic policy should be, among other things, to reduce consumer prices. What we're seeing right now is that there's a prioritization of reshoring and in fact privileging industrial production and employment. This is happening in the US, it's happening elsewhere. And this debate has, of course, kind of, is it ended or it has dissolved that orthodoxy and the kind of Washington consensus that underpinned it. But this is no longer just a domestic phenomenon. We're already seeing the impact on the multilateral trading system, the multilateral financial system, and also on technological diffusion, right? We're seeing all of the barriers that are being erected. So what then this means for low and middle income countries is that there are a lot of risks involved, risks associated with them. We don't have to go into the details here. The flow of development finance, right? That multilateral systems that upheld certain kinds of principles also may be under assault or they are weakened. But there are also opportunities around having policy autonomy, because the truth is development finance that I know a lot of us are kind of, we are in despair about the future of development finance, but that development finance did come with conditionalities. Some of the conditionalities were, helpful, some were not so helpful. Conditionalities specifically around preferred policy reforms that the providers of development finance kind of encouraged in low and middle income countries. So now that the flow of development finance is very uncertain in some respects, and depending on the numbers you look at, that flow is less of a stream and more of a trickle in some respects. There might be a window of opportunity there for countries to be able to decisively define their development priorities. But the question is, will those countries seize those opportunities? Do they even understand that those opportunities exist? Specifically around industrial upgrading, right? So export promotion, when we strip export promotion down to some of its fundamentals, in a low-income country that has limited infrastructure, that would require building roads that may not necessarily make a lot of immediate financial sense, but they need to be built to connect rural areas to urban centers to ports. There's the need for, obviously, electricity. There's a need for rail lines. And in all of the infrastructure that is being built, there needs to be redundancies. These are not infrastructure projects that typically were financed by development lenders or policy banks. So this is the policy space that is being created by some of the uncertainties that we're seeing right now. So that's really the first question, whether countries will seize this opportunity to shape their development policy priorities. The second question is around export markets, and it's around whether low and middle income countries can secure, in some cases, or maintain their access to export markets in high income countries. And this goes directly to your point around rich customers. I mean, the evidence as you presented, but there's also a large literature here that firms just perform better across different metrics when they are able to export. Because export, some of the literature has to do with exporting makes them more competitive, right? And then some of the literature has to do with, as you mentioned, improving quality. But clearly with the upheaval in the global trading system right now, and with the trade barriers that are being erected across the board, there's a lot of uncertainty around the continued access to export markets in high-income countries. So I give one example here, the Generalized System of Preferences, which is a preferential trade program that's meant to give low-income, I think even lower middle-income countries access to rich country markets. At least the US version expired in 2020 and has not been reauthorized, right? So that's just like one specific example. And then even having a free trade agreement clearly is not a guarantee of having access to an export market. And maybe the final point, and I'll just pose it without going into an elaborate explanation, has to do with coordination. I think this is quite important. And it goes to the social learning point that you mentioned, whether if a country decides to pursue industrial policies and maybe can reasonably pursue those policies effectively, whether that country can step back and think about coordinating with neighboring countries. And this particularly applies to countries that have small economies, countries that are low income, countries that have populations that are dispersed, they have perhaps a limited pool of labor, and for a whole range of reasons, that industrial policy perhaps might need to move beyond being national to being more regional. I'll stop there, sorry, I took more time.
Very important points, and bringing in a comparative perspective to India and Bangladesh, and what were the other countries? Pakistan, South Asian countries. So I have to ask the organizers whether, in fact, we have time for Q&A. 10 minutes? All right. Oh, wow. Oh my gosh. Okay. Can we, I'll start back by the cameras. There was a hand up back there. And please identify yourself.
I am Nityananda from Council for Social Development. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Earlier I saw only hexagon and T-shaped patches football. Now I see not many pentagons from Adidas. I'm happy to know that you had a role there. But my question is, I was also involved with what we call resource efficiency initiative in some Indian firms, some 7-8 years ago. Professor Mr. Ajay Shankar might know it. And their resource efficiency initiative. And there I found that the greatest resistance actually came from the entrepreneurs, not the employees. Because in most cases it involves some upfront cost, though ultimately there will be cost savings. When you reduce wastage, when you improve your material use efficiency. But this was not understood. They thought there are risks involved. So that was my experience. So my question to you is that when you say that 8% savings in material, but only 1% savings in cost, does it also include that, especially in the short run, there can be increase in labor cost because the labor's efficiency will go down? So that could be a kind of disincentive for the employers also. Secondly, my experiment, not my, but our experiment was with firms which were supplying only domestic consumers, final consumers, or even B2B consumers. And we did not have this option of approaching Adidas.
Okay.
Kind of,
Yeah.
Did you have any advantage that you could approach at
We
ANC?
have lots of people
Thank
who
you.
want to ask questions. So I would say we take 3 questions and then, so the third row back there. So, yeah, on the aisle, the woman in black.
Third row back. Thank you so much. My name is Amelia Santos from UNCTAD. I just wanted to ask about the learning effect that you mentioned. I know I didn't have much time because we did some work about demonstration effects.
Hold the mic up.
Now it's okay? Yeah, okay, perfect. No, it's just about the learning effect that you mentioned because we did some work on demonstration effect, how local firms learn from multinationals operating in the local environment. And one question and one area where we saw a lot of impact was through gender, how women moving from multinationals to domestic firms brought with them all the social norms and et cetera from the M&Es. So I don't know how much in your context you can see those type of demonstration effects through labor. I would be interested to know.
you.
Thank you.
Please, Rakesh, please.
Thank you. I had a question on one of your takeaways.
You shouldn't give up your.
Another question, one of your last takeaways, which is the role of government policy on some of the micro interventions that you were talking about. My question there is, why shouldn't it be industry associations who do that rather than the government? Because if you're talking about clusters and so on, the government can never, in some sense, at least what I know, the Indian government, can be effective in doing that kind of work, which is very important what you demonstrated. So why not talk about industry associations or cluster associations, etc. Also, the kind of experience in Germany of the Steinbeis Institute and in Baden-Württemberg, and also the Fraunhofer institutions, which are more public-private in the sense they're not really totally government.
Thank you. One more from this side. Raquel?
Thanks so much for an excellent presentation. I'm sorry you didn't have time to...
Introduce yourself.
Raquel Fernandez, professor of economics at New York University, a member of the board. You didn't have time to talk about the competition. And I was wondering why you think, why it was that competition did not have the same type of results as being an exporter. Because really, in the end, the more demanding customers, it must be that if you're not fulfilling the demand, your profits are going to be lower, or you're going to be wiped out of the market, which seems to be a competitive effect. So what do you think was giving you the difference between domestic competition and exporting, and therefore international competition?
Okay. Justin Lee. Okay, and then we'll have answers.
Well, Justin from China. Thank you very much for the very informative presentation. And my question is that the term used as industrial upgrading seems to be too narrow. From all the study you mentioned, seem to be the improvement of management or practice or technology used by a firm in a given industries. But for us in the developing country, when we talk about industrial upgrading, in general we said move from agriculture to manufacturing, and in manufacturing climb up industrial ladders from more labor intensive gradually to more capital intensive industries, like from the textile to machine building and so on. And your study did not touch upon that, at all. And my question is that, what kind of barrier for those kind of industrial upgrading that we normally understand in the developing country? Because for us, we want to fulfill aspiration to be a high-income country. We need to move up industrial ladder, and that is what normally we use in the industrial upgrading.
So, a great diverse set of questions.
Okay, thanks. Maybe I'll try to respond in reverse order. So Justin, structural transformation, I agree, is crucial. It's more ambitious than I feel that we have the knowledge to be at this point. So I'm trying to, I think that our state of our knowledge about what works and what doesn't in industrial development is relatively, undeveloped. And so I don't have confidence in what's going to drive structural transformation. That's a bigger question. I feel like we're making some progress on what's getting individual micro firms to move up the ladder a little bit, right? And I totally agree that eventually we want structural transformation, but I just don't know. I don't have confidence about how to bring that about. So I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying, but it's just I think we have to be a little bit humble at this stage of our knowledge. Raquel, yeah, so for competition. Part of the point I was going to make in those slides was sometimes it clearly matters. There was an Indian state-owned rail mill that they threatened to have entry, the SAIL, it's called, S-A-I-L. There was going to be threatened entry into production of rail, and all of a sudden their productivity increased, right? So it was clearly a positive effect of competition. Why am I less confident? Sometimes it's because competition kills off the poor performers, and now it looks like productivity is going up, but it's just because the low performers have been killed off. That's one answer. A second answer would be because sometimes there are scale effects that the more competition it is, the smaller the scale of producers, and so the less they can recover those. But I think the most interesting story is one about relational contracts that upgrading often requires, and I didn't say much about this, but requires sort of mutual investments between different firms along the supply chain. And sometimes when there's more competition, there's fewer of those relational investments. So Rocco Macchiavello and Amit Morjaria have an interesting paper on coffee in Rwanda, which is basically about that, making that point. And so anyway, just to say, words of caution, but in general, I don't want to disagree that competition also matters. Rakesh, yes, had about, why can't industry associations do this? Yeah, so there are interesting, so Sialkot, where I'm working, the industry association was basically the reason why there's an airport. There's an airport in Sialkot, it's basically the industry association did. Everyone in Pakistan talks about the fact that this is rare among industry associations that they're able to do this. It's basically the Chamber of Commerce is extremely active. So some things you would expect industry associations not to be able to do, sometimes they can do. But I think it's an exception. It requires a lot of coordination. There's lots of coordination problems, just collective action problems that we can't necessarily, I think, expect firms or groups of firms to solve on their own. Maybe in extraordinary circumstances they can, but some things, it's just like too ambitious to say, we're going to start, I don't know what it would be, build a road, or we're going to build what Simon was talking about, or infrastructure projects, or, so one thing that often lacking is quality certification procedures and agencies. Sometimes that can be solved, by individual agencies entering, but sometimes you need more of a collective, more than the individual firms or associations can do. And so it's just a question of, can those coordination, is it feasible that firms are going to solve the coordination problems, even though sometimes they can? Amelia was asking about learning through workers. I think that's a fascinating topic that we want to study about, how worker flows, which could be gendered or could be not, how often workers, as they move, carry information from one firm to the other. There are a couple of papers. There's one about in Portugal where they have employer-employee data. One firm starts exporting and the workers move, and then other firms start exporting, where they move start exporting. But we just don't have many studies, and we need more. Partly it's hard to track worker flows. In Dhaka, it's just very hard to know. It's hard to interview workers, and then it's hard to track their flow. So that's a great topic for research. I think it would be there was a question about entrepreneurs. Sometimes are the problem. It's not always workers. Sometimes entrepreneurs are the problem. In our case in Sialkot with the soccer balls, the increased labor costs were much smaller than the gains from reduced waste, and so by order of magnitude actually. So clearly there was a surplus there that was not being realized. Can I go back to also to sign up? Yes, very quick? Yeah, but just to say, thank you very much for the discussion. That was great. I totally agree that the granularity is important, and I would love to hear more, India-specific examples. And then, I was thinking about this, the demise of the international, or international governance in some ways, which maybe we may be experiencing. Maybe there could be some silver lining in it, in the sense that, the WTO was quite restrictive in its rules. So things like conditioning incentives on export success were not WTO compliant. And so now that the WTO is essentially, or becoming defunct, that the rules are not being enforced, may actually perversely increase some space for doing industrial policy. That's a very interesting idea. It's a controversial thing to say, but I can say it. I don't have any political force to answer to. But I think it's an interesting, very interesting idea. Okay.
The 10 minutes of discussion are up, are gone. And I just want to to begin with the audience for your being here, for being attentive, and for a really good set of questions, and I wish we had time for more. I really want to thank the speaker and the discussants, and we're very grateful to you for being here at this time, and also to Zainab coming a long way, and Mr. Sharma, I think you live right here, right? But I think everyone's insights were really, really important. We've had a round of thanks for the earlier speakers, but I think it was a really engaging first round, and I won't go through because everyone's tired. But I want to take time to just thank the Indian Habitat Center for hosting us this evening, and to ISID and our colleagues, Anjali and Rakesh and others, for their partnership and support in this process. And as I said, thanks to all of you, and I think we've gotten the conference off to a lively start. And dinner will be beginning shortly. Where? Out there? But I heard the rumbling of thunder. Yeah. So was there rain? Are we? Oh, we're going to eat inside. Yeah, I just kept hearing thunder, and I thought somebody's scrambling to reorganize dinner. So we'll be eating in here. And thanks again to everyone. And we are off to a good start, and we look forward to the next 2 days. Thank you so much.
Can we request the audience to hold on for just another couple of minutes? We have a tiny memento presentation for this session. May I request Professor Deepak Nair, to present the memento to Professor Eric Vaughan. And I'm going to request Professor May I request Professor Nair to present the memento to Professor Martha Chen? Sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. I'm requesting Mr. Ajay Shankar to please present the memento to Dr. Zainab Usman. Thank you, sir. And Professor Nagesh Kumar to present the memento to Mr. Ajay Shankar. Thank you. Could we have a group photo of the speakers?